The Vietnam War is often seen as a Cold War conflict, but its story begins a century earlier. In 1858, French forces launched a campaign that would transform Vietnam and fold it into a global empire. But how did a colonial project meant to control land, labor, and resources end up producing one of the most determined independence movements of the 20th century? In this documentary, we'll explore the policies, pressures, and historical circumstances that shaped French Indochina. We'll examine how economic exploitation, cultural repression, and political centralization laid the foundations for organized resistance, long before the first American troops arrived. Along the way, we'll encounter early uprisings, reform movements, and the experience that shaped a young Nguyen Ai Quoc, later known as Ho Chi Minh. But before we get started, if you're excited to learn more about the origins of the Vietnam conflict, make sure to subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments which part of the documentary stood out to you the most. French warships entered Vietnam in 1858 and opened a campaign that unfolded in stages. First footholds on the coast, then deeper pushes up river valleys, and finally the occupation of key cities. Within a generation, treaties and force stitched the regions of Cochinchina, Annam, and Tonkin into a colonial framework aligned with Paris. Colonial officers mapped districts, registered households, and built out garrisons to enforce decrees. A bureaucracy developed that judged disputes, collected revenue, and reported dissent up a chain of command. The shift from a court-centered state to a foreign-directed administration changed how authority worked at the village gate. The creation of French Indochina folded Vietnam into a larger imperial unit with Cambodia and Laos. Hanoi and Saigon served as administrative anchors, each linked to regional resident superior offices. The colonial code standardized legal categories and tightened surveillance. Cadastral surveys documented fields and ponds. Tax ledgers turned land into taxable assets. Officials issued licenses for everything from presses to markets, and they enforced a pass system for movement. The purpose was predictable governance and rapid response, which meant collecting information at a scale earlier rulers had not attempted. Land policy sat at the core. Concessions transferred large tracts to European firms and local collaborators, while traditional communal holdings shrank. New taxes on land, salt, alcohol, and households demanded regular cash, pushing peasants to sell labor seasonally or permanently leave home. Plantation belts grew along suitable soils, fed by contract labor whose terms bound workers with advances and penalties. Corvée obligations built roads and drainage, and failure to meet quotas triggered fines or jail. As cash needs rose, lenders gained leverage, and foreclosure became a route to dispossession. Resistance appeared early and adapted. Some leaders organized local uprisings that targeted tax stations or seized rice. Others built secret networks that funneled messages between pagodas, guilds, and student circles. Arrests created new links, as prisoners from different regions met, traded methods, and carried tactics back out. Rural militancy ebbed and flowed with harvests, floods, and price shifts, while urban activists experimented with petitions, boycotts, and clandestine pamphlets. The colonial police learned to read these rhythms, and repression tightened, but the pattern of action and counteraction spread organizing skills. French influence reshaped daily life. The state promoted the Romanized script, Hoc Nu, in schools and notices, accelerating literacy among groups who had not studied classical texts. Mission schools and Franco-Indigenous programs trained clerks and teachers who moved between villages and towns. Architecture in major cities adopted European street grids, with municipal buildings, cathedrals, and villas lining straight avenues. Cafes, newspapers, and clubs introduced new public spaces where news circulated quickly and where surveillance often followed. In markets and classrooms, language mixed, Vietnamese, French, Chinese dialects, creating a wider field for debate and exchange. These shifts split society. A cohort of Vietnamese elites secured posts as interpreters, tax collectors, and merchants tied to French contracts. Their fortunes depended on the reliability of the colonial order and the flows of export commodities. The rural majority faced tighter obligations and fewer buffers against bad seasons. Migration increased as families moved toward estates, mines, and ports, seeking wages that could meet tax deadlines. Social distance widened. Town clothes, office hours, and pay scales marked difference as clearly as law. Saigon, reworked with broad boulevards and European-style cafes, gained a nickname that compared it to Paris. The image projected comfort and order, but it also concentrated authority and resources in urban centers. That concentration drew workers and students who would later link neighborhoods to plantations and river deltas through new associations and quiet channels. The next phase of this story follows the tracks, wires, and docks that stitch these places together. A departure in 1911 set the course. A young man from Guyane signed onto a French steamer and left under a modest job title, moving through ports in Asia before crossing toward Europe. Work followed wherever wages were steady: kitchens, docks, service posts. Long hours in back rooms opened doors to conversations in workers' quarters and cheap cafes, where sailors, migrants, and students compared notes about law, pay, and the reach of colonial power. The route widened to London, then to cities on the Atlantic seaboard of the United States, and back to France, each stop adding another layer of contact with unions, immigrant neighborhoods, and print shops. Exposure to empire abroad clarified how colonial systems operated at home. Police in Marseille treated North African laborers with a familiar hierarchy. Race rules on London's docks echoed limits imposed in Asian ports. In New York, wartime shortages and strikes revealed how food, prices, and policy intertwined. The same patterns reappeared: unequal wages, passports as control tools, and newspapers that set the terms of public debate. A traveler with sharp observational habits could track these links and test arguments against lived experience, shifting from grievance to study. Study became organization. Socialist reading circles and labor groups offered a practical curriculum: meeting minutes, dues, strike votes, and mutual aid. Class struggle was not an abstract slogan in these rooms. It was a schedule, with picket lines at dawn and leaflets on payday. Contacts within French socialist networks provided introductions to printers and editors willing to run colonial questions. The Atlantic years forged discipline: small tasks done reliably, messages carried across languages, and a knack for moving unnoticed through surveillance. Writing amplified the impact. Articles and pamphlets criticized forced labor, special taxes, and the fiction of civilizing missions, signed under names that shifted often. A pseudonym protected the author and also allowed a piece to speak from different angles: a worker, a colonized subject, a correspondent abroad. The output grew steady enough to build a reputation within circles that tracked anti-imperial news. Editorial boards learned to expect clean copy, sharp statistics, and a focus on policy mechanisms rather than invective. By 1919, the path led to Paris, where an 8-point petition asked for basic civil liberties and representative institutions for Vietnamese subjects. The document circulated among journalists and diplomats at the peace conference, but did not gain a hearing from decision-makers. The rebuff clarified a limit in liberal channels for colonial demands. Friends and socialist organizations debated tactics, while police files thickened with notes on meetings and associates. The next step moved from petitions to a doctrine. Participation in the 1920 split of the French Socialist Party aligned this traveler with the Communist International, which promised resources and a framework for anti-imperial work. Training and assignments connected Paris, Moscow, and South China with instruction on united fronts, peasant work, and clandestine procedure. Reports evaluated conditions in Indochina, landlord power, tenant burdens, and the potential of a disciplined party to knit scattered grievances into action. Aliases multiplied as responsibilities grew. Win I Quoc, Win the Patriot, became the most visible signature, but records point to well over 50 names used across articles, letters, and travel papers. The variety frustrated colonial police and allowed cross-border movement under shifting identities. In Guangzhou, contacts with expatriate communities and youth leagues yielded study circles, newspapers, and training classes for organizers bound for ports and villages. Cells formed around familiar routines, literacy lessons, night meetings, and print bundles moving in baskets and along riverboats. By the early 1940s, the profile was clear: a seasoned organizer with a portable toolkit, press, party, and front organizations, calibrated for a peasant-majority society. Years in kitchens and corridors had translated into a method for linking dock workers to farmers, students to printers, and urban rumor to rural complaint. The map traced from Gaillon to Paris and back sketched a new route home, one that would meet a rapidly shifting wartime landscape. In 1940, Japan moved into Indochina under agreements with Vichy France, then tightened control as the war deepened. The arrangement left French administrators in office, but without real power, and authority fractured. Customs posts, rail lines, and rice shipments served Japanese needs first, while colonial police tried to keep order with fewer resources and less legitimacy. By early 1945, Tokyo sidelined what remained of French control in a swift coup. The result was an occupation that claimed stability but produced scarcity, fear, and openings for new actors. In 1941, Ho Chi Minh crossed back into the northern borderlands and helped establish the Vietnam Doc Lap Dong Minh, Viet Minh, a front designed to rally across regions and social lines. The program stressed independence over narrow party labels, bringing peasants, students, small traders, and some landlords into the same tent if they agreed on the goal. Meetings took place in stilt houses and caves. Messages moved by footpaths and riverboats. Local committees paired political education with practical relief, laying the groundwork for administration where the state presence had thinned. Vo Wen-Giap began organizing the armed wing from mountain bases near the Chinese frontier. Training focused on small units, mobility, and tight discipline. Recruits learned scouting, sabotage of bridges and roads, and rules for conduct with civilians to secure shelter and food. Weapons were a mix: homemade explosives, captured rifles, and a few arms smuggled from across the border. Commanders emphasized intelligence gathering, counting patrols, memorizing schedules, and mapping storehouses. The approach avoided big battles in favor of ambushes and raids that raised costs for the occupiers without inviting annihilation. Wartime requisitions and transport breakdowns converged with poor harvests to produce famine in 1944 and 1945, especially in the north. Villages sold tools and land. Families moved along rail lines seeking rice that had been diverted to depots. The crisis undercut both Japanese and French claims to authority. Viet Minh teams seized stockpiles, organized communal kitchens, and enforced price rules in some markets. When relief arrived from these channels, allegiance followed. Networks widened as survival and politics merged. Contact with the U.S. Office of Strategic Services added another layer. As Allied attention turned to disrupting Japanese supply lines, OSS officers operating from bases in southern China looked for reliable partners on the ground. Viet Minh couriers and guides offered terrain knowledge and safe crossings. In return, select units received training in demolition, radio use, and small unit tactics. Intelligence flowed both ways: reports on troop movements and depot locations, and guidance on how to avoid friendly fire during operations. Material aid remained limited, but mattered. Airdrops and deliveries supplied radios, medical kits, and a small number of firearms and explosives. Training sessions produced radio operators who could send concise updates under pressure. Guerrilla units applied new skills to sabotage key points, rails, culverts, and communication lines, while avoiding engagements that risked their core cadres. The assistance did not transform capacity overnight, but it improved coordination and reach during a crucial window. A striking footnote came when OSS personnel treated Ho Chi Minh during a serious illness in 1945. Field medics stabilized the patient and kept lines of contact open while recovery progressed. That episode sits awkwardly next to the later conflict, but reflects the contingencies of wartime cooperation. By August, as Japan's position collapsed, the Viet Minh could move from shadow governance to open control in towns and provinces where their networks were strongest, ready to contest the vacuum left behind. Japan's surrender in August 1945 collapsed the thin arrangement that had kept French administrators in their posts under occupation. Authority unraveled almost overnight. Provincial offices waited for orders that never arrived, while Japanese garrisons focused on disarming French units and avoiding clashes with local forces. Rail depots sat full of materiel no one claimed, and police stations measured risk before acting. That vacuum reached from border towns to Saigon and Hanoi, and into county seats where clerks weighed which seals would matter next week. With no clear sovereign, decisions flowed to whoever could provide food, security, and a recognizable chain of command. The Viet Minh moved first and moved fast. Cadres who had handled famine relief and intelligence in the preceding years pivoted to public authority. They called meetings, replaced officials who fled or hesitated, and formed committees to oversee rice, security, and communications. Armed teams entered city halls and prefecture offices with lists of names and tasks already assigned. In many places, opposition remained limited to confusion rather than organized pushback. The August Revolution unfolded not as a single battle, but as a series of coordinated seizures: post offices, radio stations, arsenals, and telephone exchanges. Control of broadcasts and wires mattered as much as rifles, because it set the narrative in every district that heard the new orders. In Hanoi, the stakes were highest. Negotiations with other nationalist groups and religious leaders aimed to avoid a civil fight that would invite outside intervention. Meetings ran late into the night as delegates argued over portfolios, police control, and the timing of public rallies. The result was a provisional government with defined roles, a calendar for announcements, and a plan to extend authority into neighborhoods through ward committees. City employees, clerks, technicians, tram operators kept services running under new instructions, which signaled continuity even as leadership shifted. Seizures of strategic nodes happened before any foreign force could reimpose a rival framework. Railway police answered to new supervisors. Telegraph offices sent bulletins drafted by Viet Minh committees, and loudspeaker trucks carried the same lines to markets and factory gates. At ministries and municipal buildings, guards changed armbands and stamped papers that kept trade and rationing moving. That administrative rhythm, paperwork, schedules, seals, legitimized the change in a way that banners could not. On September 2, 1945, Ba Dinh Square filled with a mass audience to witness a Declaration of Independence. The staging was simple: a platform, a microphone, and a document that laid out sovereignty as a claim rooted in wartime sacrifice and collective will. The speech drew on principles tied to the U.S. Declaration of Independence and to currents that flowed from the French Revolution, framing rights and national self-determination as standards the wider world already recognized. The text presented independence not as a break launched in isolation, but as a claim aligned with ideas that Europe and America had said were universal. The delivery capped weeks of coordinated action. Security units controlled access points, volunteers managed the crowd, and runners moved copies of the text to printers for wider distribution. Radio carried the announcement beyond Hanoi, while provincial committees staged parallel rallies that echoed the same language, giving the event a national footprint in real time. Among the crowd stood American OSS officers who had worked with Viet Minh cadres against Japan earlier that year. Their presence marked a brief intersection, foreign intelligence observing a government asserting authority, in a square that connected wartime networks to a new state's first public act. The next contest would come from those intent on reversing that act. Talks between Ho Chi Minh and French officials broke down in late 1946 after months of skirmishes, rival patrols, and disputes over customs posts and policing. Hanoi grew tense as both sides reinforced positions and searched buildings, each claiming the other had breached earlier understandings. When firefights erupted in the city in December, barricades went up, artillery spoke from French strongpoints, and the Viet Minh pulled back from open streets. Evacuations and blackouts followed, and the conflict shifted from contested neighborhoods to a wider war that reached into the Red River Delta and beyond. Vo Nguyen Diep read the balance quickly. Urban defense against French armor and aircraft meant attrition on the occupiers' terms, so the command shifted weight to rural zones. Small units operated from base areas in the hills and along river valleys, hitting outposts, ambushing convoys, and cutting telegraph lines. Recruits trained on scouts work, measuring distances, tracking patrol patterns, and learning how to disappear at dawn. The strategy leaned on mobility and patience, creating pressure through many small actions, rather than a single decisive fight. French commanders tried to restore control with a lattice of fortified posts and mobile columns backed by air power and riverine craft. Garrisons guarded crossroads, bridges, and market towns. Patrols pushed out daily to project presence and gather intelligence. Aircraft spotted trails, strafed suspected camps, and resupplied isolated positions. Fast boats patrolled the rivers that served as highways through the delta. The network looked strong on maps, but distance and terrain forced thin coverage, and posts depended on convoys that ran predictable routes. Viet Minh units built strength by pairing military action with political work. Cadres held quiet meetings in village communal houses, organized rice contributions, and explained the aims of the war in simple terms. Night operations became routine. Messages moved after dark, patrols crossed fields when dogs were quiet, and sappers crept close to wire. Local guides narrowed the risk of ambushes gone wrong, and small stores of ammunition rotated among units to keep pressure even when supplies were tight. Each successful raid pulled new recruits and widened the intelligence net. Training emphasized discipline with civilians as a source of legitimacy. Units paid for food when possible, kept strict rules against looting, and settled disputes through local committees. That approach, repeated across districts, contrasted with the fears tied to searches, fort demolitions, and sweeps. Villages that saw schools reopened and harvests protected tended to pass on warnings about French patrols and provide couriers willing to take risks. Over time, the movement's promise of land reform, carefully paced to avoid alienating allies too soon, gave peasants another reason to cooperate. France faced rising costs. Maintaining scattered posts, flying regular sorties, and rotating metropolitan and colonial troops strained budgets and patience at home. Political debates in Paris reflected battlefield stalemates and casualty lists that offered no end date. As the war lengthened, commanders relied more on indigenous auxiliaries and regional forces, which varied in training and loyalty. Every month of expense and uncertainty strengthened the Viet Minh's claim to represent the countryside's endurance. A striking detail from these years underscored ingenuity under scarcity. Couriers moved supplies on modified bicycles that could carry up to 400 pounds. Loaded with straps and wooden braces, these machines rolled along jungle paths where trucks couldn't go, keeping forward units stocked without engines or fuel. The line between a village's workshop and a frontline outpost narrowed to the push of a tire over mud and roots, and that quiet logistics chain kept the war moving into its next phase. By 1950, the war in Vietnam no longer looked like a colonial dispute on the edge of empire. The Cold War put it on a larger map. Capitals measured gains and losses not by provinces taken, but by alignments. The battlefield became a node in a global contest where recognition, aid, and ideology shaped the tempo as much as any local offensive. Each decision in Hanoi, Paris, Beijing, Moscow, and Washington carried weight beyond Indochina's borders. The People's Republic of China recognized the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and opened the border for assistance. Advisors moved into base areas to train battalions, set up staff schools, and standardize tactics. Warehouses near the frontier stocked rifles, mortars, and ammunition. Logistics officers taught maintenance, field sanitation, and how to move supplies by night along marked trails. Instruction stressed concentrated fire, coordinated platoons, and political education to hold units together under pressure. Workshops repaired weapons on site, so frontline units did not bleed capacity waiting for distant depots. Soviet support added another layer. Diplomatic backing increased the DRV's standing in international forums, while shipments, often routed through China, brought radios, medicines, and heavier weapons in limited quantities. Technical manuals and training materials circulated through staff courses. Radios tightened command and control, allowing dispersed companies to strike in sequence rather than in isolation. The Viet Minh's headquarters could coordinate multi-day operations and adjust to French movements faster than before. Across the line, the United States reframed the conflict as part of a wider struggle against communism. Aid missions assessed French needs and drew up packages that linked materiel to benchmarks. Funding covered aircraft, armored cars, artillery, trucks, and communications gear. Equipment modernized colonial forces and their local auxiliaries, while maintenance contracts and spare parts kept them in the field. Instructors emphasized mobility, rapid reaction, and combined arms. Airfields expanded, river patrols gained better craft, and paratroop units sharpened their roles as quick-strike tools. French planning adjusted to the influx. Commanders created groupements mobiles, fast columns that could move along roads and waterways, hit suspected bases, and withdraw before units were fixed in place. Strongpoints guarded junctions and valleys, supported by reconnaissance flights that mapped trails and counted huts. Intelligence sections grew, fed by aerial photos and intercepted traffic. The lattice of posts thickened near the Red River Delta, and efforts to seal borders aimed to choke the flow of arms and cadres. As both sides drew strength from patrons, the war's scale and lethality rose. Operations extended farther from the old outposts into border zones and highlands. Artillery duels reached villages that had only known rifle fire. Casualty stations multiplied in caves and in mission hospitals. Civilian displacement increased along key routes, and harvests suffered where patrols crossed fields during planting and reaping. Each campaign now tested supply chains that ran well beyond Vietnam's mountains and deltas. The new balance did not settle into stasis. Viet Minh units shifted from raids to larger set-piece attacks when conditions aligned, using improved firepower and rehearsed coordination. French forces, better equipped, attempted to force decisive engagements by holding fortified positions that could be resupplied by air. Both gambits relied on outside support to sustain tempo. By 1954, the United States had been paying more than 75% of all French military expenses in Indochina, a number that underlined how the anti-colonial war had been folded into a global subsidy line. The next move would test whether materiel and outposts could fix an enemy that preferred to choose the ground. French commanders selected a remote valley near the Laotian border and built a fortress ringed by strongpoints, trenches, and barbed wire. An airstrip at the center promised steady resupply and quick reinforcement, while artillery and paratroop units gave the garrison confidence that it could absorb attacks and punish any massed assault. The logic was straightforward: draw the Viet Minh into open ground far from their bases, force a set-piece battle, and break the opponent with superior firepower and airlift. Concrete, sandbags, and overlapping fields of fire turn named positions into a map of confidence pinned to a single runway. Vo Nguyen Giap declined the invitation. Instead of launching head-on attacks, staff officers charted trails over ridgelines and into ravines, and supply units began moving in the opposite direction of French expectations. The plan relied on patience, concealment, and relentless engineering. Workers cut switchbacks into slopes, built camouflage depots, and organized porter battalions that could move by night. The effort assembled a ring in the high ground, not a column on the valley floor. Each day tightened the vise without triggering the decisive engagement the fortress sought. The Viet Minh dug forward from the hills toward the perimeter, laying out trench lines that crawled across paddies and scrub. Saps crept up to wire, and communication trenches linked firing points to command posts and aid stations. The network absorbed artillery shock and allowed units to rotate undercover. As the lines advanced, outlying French strongpoints found themselves isolated, with patrols taking fire from angles that the original plan had not accounted for. The airstrip, once a lifeline, became a target mapped by observers who could now range shells onto its length. Artillery made the difference. Crews hauled guns into mountain hides using hand-built sleds, ropes, and sheer labor, moving pieces through jungle gullies that French intelligence had judged impassable. Emplacements cut into rock and reinforced with logs fired on the runway, fuel dumps, and command posts. Each successful salvo cratered the landing zone and forced pilots into riskier approaches, until landings and takeoffs became sporadic and then rare. Airdrops shifted to parachutes, but wind and ground fire scattered bundles, and many fell into Viet Minh lines. Inside the valley, shortages set in. Medical stations ran low on bandages and antibiotics. Repair teams stripped damaged aircraft and vehicles for parts. Attempts to retake key hillsides met walls of trenchworks and accurate counterfire. Paratroop reinforcements jumped into deteriorating conditions and found themselves committed to holding shrinking perimeters under constant bombardment. French units fought hard at each named strongpoint, but coordination faltered as communications blinked out and supply collapsed. One position after another fell. With the airstrip neutralized and outer defenses reduced, the core garrison lost the ability to maneuver. Surrenders began sector by sector, culminating in the capture of thousands of soldiers. News traveled quickly to Paris, where the scale of the defeat cut through political arguments and public patience. Military planners faced a blunt assessment. The fortress strategy had failed against an opponent that turned mountains into artillery platforms and trenches into roads. The outcome forced a political reckoning. Negotiations accelerated, and France's appetite for continuing a war on those terms diminished. Dien Bien Phu marked the practical end of colonial ambitions in Southeast Asia and pushed the conflict onto a diplomatic table that now had to account for battlefield realities written into that valley. The next chapter moves from guns to conferences, where maps and signatures would try to fix what guns had revealed. Dien Bien Phu left France with little leverage, so foreign ministers met in Geneva to decide what would replace battlefield decisions. The agenda reached beyond Vietnam and Laos to Cambodia, but Vietnam dominated the sessions. Delegations arrived with different clocks in mind. Some wanted a ceasefire that froze gains. Others pushed for a political roadmap that would not hand victory to either camp. The rooms split between those who fought on the ground and those who armed and advised from afar. Yet all agreed the war could not continue as it had. Talks drew in the United States, the Soviet Union, China, Britain, and France, alongside Vietnamese representatives from the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and from the southern state of Vietnam. Side meetings mattered as much as plenaries. Chinese and Soviet envoys signaled support for a settlement that reduced the risk of direct confrontation with the West while preserving influence over allies. American officials respected the conference process without committing to outcomes they believed might legitimize communist control. French negotiators balanced military exhaustion at home with the need to protect remaining interests in the region. The outcome coalesced around a military truce and a political promise. The Geneva Accords set a ceasefire and created regrouping zones to separate opposing forces. The most visible line sat along the 17th parallel, a military demarcation intended to be temporary, with a buffer zone monitored by an international supervisory commission. Units north and south began scheduled withdrawals and exchanges, and commanders passed maps and coordinates through liaison teams to reduce accidental clashes as they repositioned. The political provision pointed forward. The agreement called for nationwide elections in 1956 to reunify Vietnam under a single government. In the meantime, each zone would administer its territory without importing new troops or forming foreign alliances that could upset the balance. International oversight would report violations and mediate disputes. The framework assumed that time and ballots could settle what artillery and ambushes had not, and that outside powers would restrain clients until a vote. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam accepted the temporary division as a stage, not an end state. Leadership prioritized consolidation, regrouping troops, resettling families, and building administrative depth in the north. Propaganda and cadre training focused on patient preparation for elections and on keeping contacts alive in the South through political networks, not open warfare. Land policies and reconstruction programs aimed to show competence and legitimacy ahead of any national vote. In the South, the state of Vietnam presented a different stance. Backed by American aid and advisors, it refused to sign the final declaration and raised doubts about holding a nationwide vote under conditions it considered skewed by Northern control. Leaders argued that security, refugee resettlement, and institution building required time, and they expanded police and intelligence services to monitor rivals. Foreign assistance supported the creation of a national army, radio networks, and administrative reforms designed to anchor authority in Saigon. One detail from the maps became a symbol far beyond its original purpose. The 17th parallel had been designated as a temporary military line to keep armies apart while diplomats arranged a political solution. Yet over the next years, it hardened into a frontier with outposts, barbed wire, and patrols. What started as a truce marker gained the weight of a border that drew migration, propaganda, and military planning to its edges. As regrouping deadlines passed, both zones treated the divide as a strategic fact while preparing for the tests that would follow. Appointed Prime Minister of the State of Vietnam in 1954, Diem faced a fractured South with competing armed groups, refugee influxes, and a shaky bureaucracy. The first task was survival inside Saigon's political maze. He replaced provincial chiefs, vetted police, and tightened control over budgets that had flowed through old French channels. Cabinet shuffles brought relatives and loyalists into key posts, building a compact inner circle that could issue orders quickly and check rivals who still had guns and revenue. To remove the last link to the monarchy, Diem staged a referendum in October 1955 to depose Bao Dai, the former emperor turned chief of state. Ballot design, district-level supervision, and control of media favored the prime minister. The result created the Republic of Vietnam, with Diem as president, giving legal cover to a state that claimed sovereignty apart from colonial frameworks. New symbols and rituals followed, a constitution, an anthem, and ceremonies that framed a fresh start, while older patronage networks reattached to the new presidency. Stability required breaking the power of militias that ran neighborhoods, docks, and gambling dens. The Binh Duen, a criminal police syndicate entrenched in Saigon's security services, posed the biggest challenge. After a tense standoff, government troops launched operations to clear strongholds around the city and retake revenue streams linked to casinos and protection rackets. Religious armies, notably Cao Dai and Hua Hao factions, also faced pressure. Some commanders accepted deals for integration into the National Army, while others were sidelined or arrested. By centralizing force under the Ministry of Defense, the presidency turned the capital from a patchwork of fiefdoms into a seat of authority. The United States viewed Diem as a bulwark against the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and increased aid. Advisors helped reorganize the army, expand radio networks, and modernize logistics. Dollar flows funded roads, airfields, and administration. Training programs introduced staff procedures, intelligence units, and rural security plans. Washington's backing gave the Saigon government credibility abroad and leverage at home, as officials could promise salaries, equipment, and projects to provinces that aligned with the center. Policy at the village level carried costs. Land measures rolled out cautiously, and resettlement schemes moved families, especially northern refugees, into strategic areas. Catholic communities often received priority in services and protection, a pattern that fed resentment among Buddhists and rural populations who felt bypassed by new opportunities. Security sweeps targeted suspected communist networks, but also disrupted markets and harvest cycles. Local officials collected intelligence and enforced loyalty oaths, while press controls narrowed the space for critics. Corruption crept through procurement, customs, and land transactions. Officials brokered contracts and licenses, and bribes became part of routine approvals. Complaints filtered up about arbitrary arrests, favoritism, and the use of public funds to reward factions. Opposition figures faced detention or tight surveillance, pushing political life toward one-party habits even as elections and assemblies remained on the calendar. The government's successes against militias and rivals did not translate into durable trust, where taxes, rents, and roadblocks bit hardest. Strategic hamlets and relocation projects promised security by clustering households behind fences and watchtowers, but administration outpaced delivery. Poor planning and forced movement hardened attitudes, while cadres slipped around checkpoints at night. Village chiefs weighed whether compliance brought more trouble than protection. Meanwhile, guerrilla activities in outlying districts probed for weak points in sympathetic hamlets, testing the promise of centralized control. Diem privately assessed that nationwide elections would favor Ho Chi Minh by a wide margin, more than 80% in a free vote. That belief, combined with the state building underway, set the course. Consolidate in the South, avoid a timetable that risked defeat at the ballot box, and build institutions that could withstand the next phase of the conflict. By the late 1950s, repression and arrests in the South pushed underground networks to reassess tactics. Leaders in the Democratic Republic of Vietnam concluded that petitions and quiet organizing no longer protected Southern cadres from sweeps, village surveillance, and prison camps. Directives authorized a renewed insurgency, shifting local committees toward armed self-defense and selective offensives. Couriers carried new guidelines along old liaison trails through the Central Highlands and border zones, linking hamlets to border bases that could supply training and basic weapons. The move did not appear all at once. District by district, units tested pressure points and mapped which officials, roads, and depots mattered most. In 1960, the National Liberation Front formed to gather rural activists, students, religious figures, and disaffected officials under one banner. The platform stressed independence, land, and representative government, giving village elders and trade groups a language they could endorse without signing on to a single party. Committees handled propaganda, recruitment, and liaison with armed teams. The structure let sympathizers join at different levels: public associations in towns, clandestine clusters in the countryside, while a parallel chain managed security and discipline. This umbrella made it easier to coordinate actions across provinces without exposing the core leadership to routine police raids. The label Viet Cong spread through government communiques and U.S. reporting to describe NLF guerrillas and their supporters. Officials in Saigon used the term in arrest notices, press briefings, and psychological operations, while advisors in American missions adopted the same shorthand in field reports. Over time, the name covered a wide range of participants, from full-time fighters to village lookouts and suppliers. That broad usage influenced targeting lists and created pressure on communities where a cousin's role as a cook or courier could pull an entire household into risk. Strategy hardened as Le Duan pressed for an accelerated effort. Southern cadres received instruction to expand armed propaganda teams, form local guerrilla squads, and build district-level companies capable of coordinated ambushes. Land issues took center stage. Rent reductions, debt cancellations, and redistribution plans helped win shelter, food, and intelligence. Training emphasized mine-laying, night movement, and fast dispersal after attacks. Commanders mapped how to strike at isolated posts, seize weapons, and avoid set-piece battles that would bring aircraft and artillery. Network building followed practical lines. Underground cells formed around kinship and work ties, using pagodas, markets, and farm cooperatives as meeting points. Night operations moved messages through fields and along canals, while daytime routes stayed ordinary to deflect attention. Safe houses stored medical supplies and spare clothing. Caches near irrigation ditches hid rifles wrapped in oilcloth. Couriers memorized routes and rotated paths to avoid patterns. In contested districts, shadow administrations set tax rates, settled disputes, and assigned labor for road repair and harvest protection, claiming the functions of rule where the state appeared only as patrols. Operations targeted leverage. Assassination campaigns focused on village chiefs, informants, and tax officials who enforced Saigon's writ. Ambushes struck at convoy choke points marked by weak bridges and predictable timetables. Saboteurs cut telephone lines, blew culverts, and burned warehouses holding fertilizer and rice, creating ripple effects in market towns. Each action calibrated risk against payoff. A wounded district chief could disrupt conscription and intelligence collection for months. Engineers added a hidden layer beneath the fighting. Tunnel complexes expanded into subsurface villages, with kitchens venting through zigzag chimneys, wells sunk into clean layers, clinics, armories, and trap-filled corridors. Vent shafts doubled as observation points. Trapdoors disguised with laterite and leaf litter opened into escape routes that surfaced in orchards and bamboo thickets. These systems let units absorb bombardment, evade sweeps, and reappear where patrols had just declared a zone cleared. By 1963, the insurgency had shaped daily life across large parts of the Mekong Delta, the Central Highlands, and districts around Saigon. Checkpoints multiplied, night travel required permission, and families calculated which authority could provide protection without inviting retaliation. The state fought back with raids, strategic hamlets, and informant networks, but each expansion of force fed new grievances that cadres folded into recruitment. the conflict now had an engine that ran on village politics and local memory, and it was gathering speed. Street protests swelled through 1963 as Buddhist groups called out bans on flags, arrests of monks, and surveillance around pagodas. Self-immolations drew large crowds and forced the government to defend policies that privileged select communities and treated public dissent as a security threat. Police raids, confiscations of radios and printing equipment, and curfews spread from Hue to Saigon. Universities saw sit-ins and leaflets pass hand-to-hand despite searches. Provincial officials reported that village chiefs struggled to enforce loyalty oaths while facing both guerrilla pressure and urban outrage relayed by family ties. The administration responded with a mix of concessions and force, but orders from the palace countered local compromises and kept tensions high. In Washington, patience thinned. Advisors had backed state building and security programs, yet the televised raids on pagodas in August, organized by Ngo Dinh Nhiu's apparatus, signaled that repression was overtaking reform. Embassy cables weighed options: apply pressure through aid, shift contacts to alternative power centers, or accept a leadership change if the army moved. American officers in Saigon logged meetings with generals who complained about morale, recruitment, and the political cost of cracking down on Buddhists while fighting an insurgency that drew strength from government missteps. The message from many desks was consistent: the leadership was becoming an obstacle to the war effort. Inside the military, senior officers met quietly in safe houses and staff offices after hours. They mapped out who controlled armored units, radios, and key intersections. The plan required neutralizing loyalist security teams and seizing communication hubs before dawn. Coup organizers sought assurances that outside partners would not oppose a move, and the signals they received amounted to tacit encouragement. Courier chains carried code names and timelines across core zones, and warehouses quietly issued ammunition under routine paperwork to avoid alerting palace guards. Intelligence officers built lists of officers to detain at once, minimizing shootouts that could spiral. On November 1st, 1963, columns moved on the capital. Telephones went dead in key ministries, and armored cars blocked routes to the presidential palace. Loyalist units held out for hours, but command fractured as radio networks fell silent. Negotiations opened and closed in quick succession. By the next day, Ngo Dinh Diem and Ngo Dinh Nhiu were out of power and then dead. Their removal ending a decade of centralized rule and leaving a vacuum no single faction could fill. What followed inside the Republic of Vietnam was churn. A military council claimed authority, then lost it to another set of officers. Provincial chiefs waited for instructions that changed by the week. Budgets froze, then thawed under different signatures. Plans for strategic hamlets and rural programs stalled as commanders rotated and ministries rewrote directives. With no stable anchor, police, intelligence, and logistics units struggled to sync operations against an enemy that exploited pauses and mixed signals. Rival cliques inside the army competed for portfolios and patronage. Promotions rewarded loyalty more than field results, and units withheld cooperation from commanders they expected to fall. Meetings dragged as officers counted votes instead of drafting operations. The insurgency gained room to move, while the state argued with itself. Fun detail to underline the scale of this instability: in the months after the coup, South Vietnam cycled through more than a half a dozen leadership changes, turning Saigon into one of the least predictable capitals of the Cold War. Through 1964, tensions built at sea as U.S. patrols mapped North Vietnam's coastline and monitored radio traffic tied to coastal defense. Surveillance missions ran close to territorial limits, while South Vietnamese raids hit targets ashore, creating a moving mix of signals and responses. In the Gulf of Tonkin, destroyers and reconnaissance aircraft tracked patrol boats, radar sites, and logistics craft. Commanders treated the area as a testing ground for deterrence and intelligence, and North Vietnamese crews treated those approaches as provocations that needed to be pushed back. The setting made miscalculation more likely: crowded channels, fast boats, and strict rules that shifted with each contact. On August 2nd, the destroyer USS Maddox reported being approached and fired upon by North Vietnamese patrol boats. The exchange unfolded quickly, maneuvering at sea speeds, burst transmissions, and rapid calculations about angles and range. Maddox fired warning shots, then engaged, supported by carrier-based aircraft that raced to the scene. Damage aboard the destroyer remained minimal, while at least one attacking boat took serious hits. The incident sharpened the question in Washington: continue patrols as planned, or signal resolve with a stronger posture in the Gulf? President Lyndon B. Johnson moved to deter further clashes. Orders expanded the naval presence and authorized retaliatory strikes against coastal targets linked to boat bases and radar. Pilots briefed on anti-aircraft positions, run-in headings, and egress routes. Ships tightened formations and refined engagement procedures for small boat threats. The message aimed at two audiences, Hanoi and U.S. allies, showing that attacks on American vessels would bring a military answer and a steadier patrol rhythm, rather than a retreat to deeper waters. 2 nights later, August 4th, reports arrived that USS Maddox and USS Turner Joy were under attack again. Radio nets carried urgent messages, torpedo wakes sighted, fast-moving contacts on radar, evasive turns ordered, and guns fired into darkness. Weather and sea state complicated everything. Visual sightings were brief, radar returns came and went, and sonar operators listened for torpedo screws through layers of noise. By the time reports reached the Pentagon, the picture mixed alarms with uncertainty, forcing emergency deliberations while operations continued in real time. Confusion mounted as logs were reviewed. Some radar tracks matched storm clutter. Sonar data included false contacts, and lookouts reports conflicted about bearing and distance. Pilots dispatched to find attackers struggled to confirm anything on the surface. Commanders on the scene questioned their own readings, even as they executed standard responses. At headquarters, analysts weighed the risk of assuming a second attack that might not have occurred against the risk of hesitating if it had. Johnson requested congressional backing to answer aggression in Southeast Asia. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution offered broad authority to use force without a formal declaration of war, tying action to maintaining international peace and responding to threats against U.S. forces and allies. Floor debates moved quickly, shaped by the urgency of the reports and the desire to present unity abroad. Passage gave the White House a legal framework to expand operations, deploy more assets, and support South Vietnam with far fewer procedural hurdles. Later declassified documents and testimony showed that the August 4th attack almost certainly never happened. Faulty information, compounded by poor visibility and interpreting noise as torpedoes, had set a major escalation in motion. The decision chain built around that night's signals would soon scale up air campaigns, troop commitments, and a timetable that narrowed room for diplomacy while widening the war's scope. The decision came in early 1965. President Lyndon B. Johnson approved Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained air campaign aimed at forcing the Democratic Republic of Vietnam to scale back support for the insurgency in the South. The plan called for gradual pressure. Instead of a single blow, the United States would strike week after week, hoping calibrated punishment would compel concessions without triggering Chinese or Soviet intervention. Washington framed targets as military and industrial, but the signaling was as important as the bombs. The United States Air Force and United States Navy took the lead. Carrier groups in the Gulf of Tonkin launched sorties against rail yards, power stations, fuel depots, and bridges that tied the North's logistics together. From bases in Thailand and the South, fighter bombers hunted truck convoys moving at night, while reconnaissance aircraft mapped new choke points. Aerial refueling, electronic jamming, and search and rescue units formed a layered machine that could generate thousands of sorties per month. Pilots learned the contours of the Red River Delta and the karst ridgelines by repetition. North Vietnamese forces adapted almost immediately. Crews dispersed equipment into hamlets, camouflaged trucks under bamboo, and shifted depots into caves. Workers repaired tracks and roads before dawn, laying new planks and decking after every hit. An air defense network grew from scattered guns into a dense shield of anti-aircraft artillery, radar sites, and surface-to-air missiles. Batteries moved frequently, decoys appeared on empty fields, and spotters relayed flight paths by radio and bicycle. The cost to American aircraft rose as pilots flew lower to find targets and higher-value sites grew too dangerous to approach. On the ground, Johnson crossed another line. Marines landed at Da Nang in March 1965 to secure air bases, soon joined by Army units that would take the fight into the countryside. The mission shifted from guarding perimeters to seeking combat with the enemy. By the end of 1965, tens of thousands of U.S. troops were in South Vietnam, with more on the way. This marked a clear escalation from advising to fighting. General William Westmoreland set a strategy of attrition. The goal was to inflict losses faster than the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army could replace them. Search and destroy operations swept provinces, using helicopters to insert infantry near suspected base areas. Artillery and airstrikes hammered contacts to raise body counts. Free fire zones and large unit sweeps aimed to deny the enemy rest, supplies, and recruits. Commanders measured progress in tallies and maps of cleared zones, expecting cumulative pressure to grind the opposition down. The bombing campaign did not break the North's will. Industry scattered and ran on smaller, redundant facilities. Bridges fell and then returned with pontoon spans and fords. Blackouts, rationing, and evacuations strained civilians, while propaganda framed endurance as national duty. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, a web of roads and footpaths through Laos and Cambodia, expanded under fire. Despite hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs, transport continued, aided by thousands of laborers, way stations, and constant rerouting. Air war and ground war fed each other without delivering a decisive result. More troops required more bases, which drew more attacks and demanded more sorties. Each escalation triggered a countermeasure. By 1967, the United States could claim territory cleared and sorties flown, but the adversary defined success by persistence and reach. the gap between those yardsticks widened as both sides prepared for larger tests. The signals of escalation in 1967 set the stage, but the next move came from Hanoi. Senior leaders of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, with Le Duan driving the plan, approved a nationwide offensive designed to shock the Republic of Vietnam and undercut American confidence. The concept balanced military strikes with political effect. Massed attacks would hit urban centers, government hubs, and key military targets all at once. Cadres inside cities prepared caches, safe houses, and staging points months in advance. Local units rehearsed routes and timing, while infiltrators moved south along the border corridors, blending into refugee flows and night traffic. They chose Tet, the Lunar New Year, when families gathered and ceasefires had often paused the war. On the night of January 30th to 31st, 1968, Viet Cong units and North Vietnamese army formations launched coordinated assaults across the country. Mortars opened the way, then assault teams pushed through gates and alleys. In provincial capitals, squads aimed for police stations, radio transmitters, and administrative compounds. In the countryside, base camps came under fire to pin down reaction forces. The timing compressed the battlefield, making it hard for defenders to redeploy or to sort feints from main efforts. More than 100 cities, towns, and military bases were struck in near-simultaneous waves. In Saigon, sappers and rifle squads targeted the presidential palace area, the radio station, and Tan Son Nhut Air Base. The attacks disrupted traffic, communications, and command posts. Small groups held intersections to slow reinforcements, using satchel charges against armored cars and barricading streets with carts and rubble. In other urban centers, fighters seized ward offices and unfurled banners calling for uprisings, aiming to spark a political chain reaction inside South Vietnam's institutions. One action carried the most symbolic weight. A Viet Cong commando team breached the grounds of the United States Embassy in Saigon before dawn. They blasted through the outer wall, reached the courtyard, and exchanged fire with military police and rapid reaction units. Although they never entered the Chancery building and were killed or captured within hours, images of the firefight at the embassy compound told global audiences that no site was immune. The impact landed far beyond the tactical result. In Hue, the fight became a sustained urban battle. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces seized large zones on the first day, including government offices and neighborhoods on the Citadel side of the Perfume River. They set up roadblocks, emplaced machine guns in upper floors, and used courtyards and garden walls as covered lanes. U.S. Marines and South Vietnamese units moved building by building, breaking through masonry with explosives, calling in artillery on fortified houses, and slowly rolling back the front. The fighting lasted for weeks, and when the city was retaken, sections lay shattered from constant fire. The offensive cost the Viet Cong dearly. Battalions suffered high casualties, and many local networks exposed themselves by going public. Yet the operation achieved a psychological breakthrough. Official claims of steady progress looked fragile when so many targets were hit at once, and when attackers reached core sites in the capital. Public confidence wavered, and debates over strategy grew sharper as the scale of the attacks became clear. Here's the twist. Despite extensive surveillance and intercepted communications, U.S. intelligence missed key signs of the buildup, allowing North Vietnam to coordinate the largest surprise offensive of the war. That gap between data and anticipation shaped every decision that followed. Tet forced Americans to reassess. Families saw cities under attack and an embassy compound breached, and the narrative of steady progress no longer held. Doubt moved from campus corners to kitchen tables. Members of Congress called for hearings. Editors questioned official briefings. Clergy, veterans, and civil rights leaders added their voices. The question became less about tactics and more about purpose. What could victory mean, and at what cost? Polling shifted across regions and age groups, and letters poured into district offices pressing for answers on casualties, taxes, and timelines. President Lyndon B. Johnson absorbed the shock. He faced critics who said the administration had overpromised and misunderstood the enemy's capacity. The budget strain of war and domestic programs widened splits inside his party. Advisors debated further escalation versus a halt to bombing and a search for talks. By March 1968, after another round of grim assessments, Johnson announced he would not seek another term. The move stunned allies and opponents alike and signaled that political space for an open-ended war had closed. The 1968 presidential race turned into a running referendum on Vietnam. Vice President Hubert Humphrey tried to hold the party coalition while easing away from the most aggressive policies. Senator Eugene McCarthy rallied anti-war voters in primaries, proving that dissent could win delegates. Richard Nixon campaigned on restoring order and pursuing peace with honor, arguing for a negotiated end on terms that preserved South Vietnam's viability. Each candidate spoke to a different anxiety: the cost of stalemate, the fear of abandonment, and the demand for stability at home. On campuses, activism scaled up. Student groups organized teach-ins that broke down recent battles, draft procedures, and casualty figures in long sessions. Dorm lounges became printing rooms for leaflets mapping out march routes and legal advice. Sit-ins targeted draft boards and research labs tied to defense contracts. Some young men burned draft cards in public, risking prosecution to make the system visible. Faculty joined, hosting debates that brought military officers and critics into the same halls. The network spread across state schools and private universities, pulling in high school students through local coalitions. Street movements widened beyond campuses. Clergy-led marches connected war spending to local poverty. Veterans formed groups that testified about their tours and questioned the goals set for the next rotation. Labor unions split, with some locals backing demonstrations and others supporting a strong anti-communist line. City permits for marches turned into political fights. Police deployed new crowd control tactics, and television captured baton charges and tear gas drifting through downtowns. Media coverage shaped the national conversation day by day. Primetime showed firefights, medevac helicopters, and hospital wards, bringing distant provinces into living rooms. Reports from Saigon, Hue, and the Central Highlands forced viewers to reconcile official briefings with scenes of street battles and funerals. Younger audiences distrusted spokesmen who reported light casualties after images of heavy loss. Older viewers divided between calls to finish the job and demands to bring troops home. Advisors and network managers began to treat war footage and protest coverage as central programming, not side notes. Tension peaked again in 1970 at Kent State University, where a campus protest and a military response ended in gunfire and deaths. The event sharpened debate about government force, civil liberties, and the scope of dissent. Parents who had accepted earlier demonstrations as noisy but manageable now feared escalation on both sides. Colleges closed early. Governors and mayors asked for National Guard support while promising investigation. The war at home felt immediate, and local officials faced pressure to prove control without igniting another flashpoint. By 1970, the United States had experienced hundreds of major anti-war protests, a record wave of coordinated demonstrations that touched nearly every region. The sheer density of action altered policymaking calendars, campaign travel, and even police training schedules. Candidates began planning speeches around protest maps as much as polling data. Nixon stepped in with a two-part promise: reduce American ground combat and raise the capacity of South Vietnam's army. The policy took the name Vietnamization. Washington pushed for ARVN to carry more of the war, while U.S. units drew down. Advisors expanded in number and focus, moving from small teams to integrated support at corps and division levels. Training cycles intensified, from weapons handling and night fighting to logistics planning and radio discipline. New rifles, armored personnel carriers, artillery pieces, and helicopters flowed into South Vietnamese inventories, along with maintenance depots and fuel storage to keep them running. The withdrawal began in measured waves. Brigade by brigade, U.S. combat formations rotated home as ARVN battalions took over base security and regional patrols. American engineers handed off airfields and built up supply points, leaving behind warehouses of ammunition and spare parts. South Vietnamese commanders gained access to better mapping, fire support coordination, and medical evacuation procedures. The idea was to knit these capabilities into an independent force that could hold territory, run operations, and absorb losses without leaning on U.S. infantry. General Creighton Abrams recalculated how the war was fought. Large sweeps that aimed to fix and destroy enemy main forces gave way to securing population centers, roads, and markets. Mixed units patrolled around district towns to keep taxation, recruiting, and intimidation at bay. Intelligence cells tracked village-level networks to break the cycle of nighttime attacks and daylight withdrawals. Helicopter air assaults still occurred, but with tighter objectives, supporting ARVN-led pushes to disrupt local bases rather than raiding deep into remote sanctuaries for body counts. At the same time, the White House widened the battlefield beyond South Vietnam's borders. To pressure supply lines and staging areas, Nixon authorized covert bombing in Cambodia and Laos against nodes of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Crews flew under special call signs. Target lists moved through restricted channels. Bomb damage assessment remained compartmented, even from many officers who usually saw mission reports. The goal was to sever the arteries feeding units in the South without triggering a public rupture or a larger war with neighboring states. In 1970, U.S. and ARVN forces crossed into eastern Cambodia. The operation overran depots, seized rice, ammunition, documents, and vehicles, and scattered base areas used to rest and refit. For several months, cross-border pressure complicated enemy movement and delayed some planned offensives. But the news of the incursion lit a fire at home. Protests surged, campus strikes spread, and state governments faced escalating confrontations. The domestic costs rose even as commanders claimed tactical gains. Air power remained the main lever to influence talks. As negotiations in Paris inched along, the United States increased bombing density, including heavy B-52 strikes on storage sites, road junctions, and air defense hubs. Sorties aimed to raise the price of continued fighting for the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and to signal that reductions in ground troops did not mean less pressure. Combat losses, infrastructure damage, and evacuations mounted in the north, but the flow of the trail adapted, with bypasses, camouflage, and constant repair. And here's the striking piece. The secret bombing of Cambodia stayed completely unknown to the American public and much of Congress for more than a year, even though it involved thousands of sorties logged across hidden flight plans and sealed reports. By 1972, battlefield momentum swung back and forth without settling the war. Casualty lists grew while U.S. voters pressed for an end. With midterm politics and protests at home, President Richard Nixon leaned harder on diplomacy. Paris offered a venue where military pressure and negotiation could run in parallel. The administration treated talks as another front, apply leverage from the air and test openings across the table. The aim was a ceasefire that pulled out American troops, returned prisoners, and left Saigon standing. Henry Kissinger became the point man. He met Le Duc Tho in secret sessions outside the formal conference, then shifted to public formats when useful. The back-channel talks let both sides explore concessions without the glare of reporters or Allied backlash. Drafts passed between apartments and safe houses, amended line by line. Ceasefire maps, prisoner exchange timetables, and international oversight forces were all sketched and redrawn. Each advance hit a wall when the conversation turned to who governed the South after the guns fell silent. Disagreements clustered around three issues. First, the ceasefire itself. Would forces stop shooting in place, allowing northern units to remain where they stood, or would withdrawals accompany the truce? Second, political representation. Hanoi wanted a council that included communist-aligned groups in the South. Washington pushed structures that preserved Saigon's authority. Third, the long-term future of the Republic of Vietnam. Could it negotiate on equal footing, or would the agreement quietly pave a path to its replacement? These gaps stalled progress, even when language on lesser points seemed close. To raise pressure, Nixon ordered large-scale bombing to deny sanctuary and to signal stamina. After a fall breakthrough unraveled, the United States launched a concentrated series of strikes in December 1972, known as the Christmas bombings. B-52s and tactical aircraft hit rail lines, storage yards, air defenses, and power nodes around Hanoi and Haiphong. Losses mounted on both sides. The message was that talks would not shield infrastructure if negotiators walked away. Within weeks, channels reopened and texts returned to the editing table. In Saigon, President Nguyen Van Thieu pushed back. Early drafts appeared to freeze North Vietnamese units inside South Vietnam and gave political space to the Communist Front through a proposed national council. Thieu feared that accepting those terms would undercut his government's legitimacy and speed a coalition that he could not control. He demanded clarifications on withdrawals, definitions of sovereignty, and verification teams. The delays forced Washington to juggle Allied cohesion with the need to close a deal before domestic patience collapsed. Compromises followed. The final framework called for a nationwide ceasefire, the withdrawal of remaining U.S. forces on a set schedule, and the return of American prisoners of war. International observers would monitor compliance, while the political future of the South would be managed through negotiations among Vietnamese parties rather than imposed from abroad. The Paris Peace Accords were signed in January 1973. American combat units prepared their final departures as prisoner lists were verified and flights arranged. One coda stands out. Le Duc Tho shared the Nobel Peace Prize with Henry Kissinger for the agreement, but declined the award, citing unfinished conflict. The gesture captured the ambiguity of a peace that ended direct U.S. combat while leaving two armed governments facing each other, their positions fixed on paper and contested on the ground. Lights lifted off, flags came down on bases, and the war entered a new phase defined by the ink they had just laid down. Early 1975 opened with a chain of offensives from the Democratic Republic of Vietnam that moved faster than ARVN planners could absorb. Divisions pushed through the Central Highlands after testing defenses along Route 14 and key junctions linking Pleiku, Kon Tum, and Ban Mae Thuot. Once Ban Mae Thuot fell, the road network buckled. Units tasked with holding highland towns found their flanks exposed and their logistics cut. Ammunition and fuel dumps lost protection as artillery units pulled back to avoid encirclement. What began as a regional shock quickly became a rolling collapse that spread into I Corps and the northern provinces. President Nguyen Van Thieu tried to impose order through redeployments. He approved a strategic regrouping that pulled forces from remote positions to defend coastal cities and the approaches to Saigon. The plan assumed disciplined withdrawals under pressure, but crowded roads and poor communications turned movement into flight. Commanders lost contact with battalions. Some formations disintegrated during night marches as civilians swarmed highways. When Quang Tri and then Hue shifted out of government control at speed, the psychological impact cascaded down the chain of command and into local administrations. Refugee columns stretched for miles. Families fled with what they could carry, crossing bridges already under artillery threat or moving along beaches to reach fishing boats. Hospitals overflowed, then evacuated, then closed. Radios failed as transmitters ran out of power or were abandoned. The Republic of Vietnam's ministries issued directives that could not reach district offices. Provincial chiefs requested reinforcements that no longer existed. Helicopters tasked with lifting out wounded diverted to move officials and their families, creating new gaps in battlefield evacuation. As April advanced, the United States accelerated extraction plans. Operation Frequent Wind stood ready, with staging on carriers offshore and processing sites around the embassy and DAO compound at Tan Son Nhut. When fixed-wing evacuation became impossible due to shelling, helicopters took over. Marines set up perimeters, marked landing zones, and controlled entry points while staff processed South Vietnamese allies, interpreters, pilots, civil servants, and families with documentation. Flights rotated in tight cycles, lifting off with every available seat filled. The pace turned urgent as mortars and rockets fell closer to the runway and communications narrowed to essential channels. North Vietnamese Army units completed the encirclement of Saigon by late April. Columns moved along Highway 1 and secondary roads, bypassing pockets of resistance rather than wasting time on block-by-block fighting. ARVN units that remained intact focused on guarding bridges and key intersections, but ammunition shortages and desertions limited counterattacks. Negotiations for a ceasefire flickered and died as forward elements reported that armor and infantry were already in the outer districts. By April 29th, artillery could reach central neighborhoods and the airport complex. The end arrived with armor from the 2nd Corps of the North Vietnamese Army pushing into the city center on April 30th. Tanks drove past roadblocks that no longer had defenders and converged on the Independence Palace. Gates gave way as vehicles rolled into the compound. Inside, the last officials in the building faced a decision already made by events outside. The flag of the Republic of Vietnam would not fly again over its capital. For those still in the airlift, one image stood out. To clear deck space for incoming flights, some evacuation helicopters were pushed off U.S. Navy ships into the sea, a final, stark measure to keep the lift moving as the city fell. Reunification arrived with a bill that the new Socialist Republic of Vietnam could not dodge. Years of bombing and ground fighting had torn up roads, bridges, power grids, factories, and ports. Farmland needed demining and irrigation canals, while the transport network ran on patched engines and scavenged spare parts. Coal shipments stalled when rail lines failed. Urban water systems leaked pressure as pipes cracked, and rolling blackouts forced workshops to stagger work hours. Food output lagged behind population needs, so rations stretched thin and households bartered for basics. The state inherited an economy split by different currencies, systems, and standards, and had to merge them under one roof. Le Duan and senior planners chose a centralized path. The government consolidated trade and banking, set production targets, and expanded state-owned enterprises. Cooperatives absorbed smallholders, while procurement quotas fixed how much rice farmers turned over at controlled prices. Factories faced command schedules that ignored spare part shortages and machine downtime, so paperwork showed output that shop floors could not sustain. Transport bottlenecks left grain at depots while cities queued for staples. With limited foreign exchange and spare credit, imports of fertilizer, diesel, and industrial inputs fell short. Living conditions slid as wages chased rising food and fuel costs. Political consolidation followed the economic drive. Former officials, officers, and civil servants of the Republic of Vietnam, along with some teachers, doctors, and religious leaders, received orders to report for re-education. Many expected short sessions. Many stayed for months or years. Camps assigned labor on farms, in forests, and at small workshops. Families traveled long distances for visits and lost breadwinners during key harvests. The policy reshaped communities through absence, as neighborhoods filled with grandparents and children coping with sudden gaps in income and care. At the shoreline, another pressure built. Refugees took to the sea in small boats, fishing trawlers, and makeshift craft. Smugglers demanded payments in gold. Pirates attacked in the Gulf of Thailand. Storms scattered convoys. Some boats drifted for days with broken engines, rationing water and sharing a handful of dried food. Regional states tightened entry, even as camps grew in Malaysia, Thailand, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. International agencies organized resettlement, but departures outpaced placements for years. The boat people crisis turned Vietnam's domestic strain into a regional and global management problem. Foreign policy choices added new costs. In late 1978, Vietnamese forces invaded Cambodia, overthrew the Khmer Rouge, and installed a new government in Phnom Penh. The move removed a hostile regime but brought condemnation, trade restrictions, and reduced access to aid from a range of countries. Sanctions cut hard when the economy needed credit lines and spare parts. Border trade shrank, and Vietnamese units garrisoned inside Cambodia for years, absorbing manpower and supplies that could not repair roads or power plants at home. The pressure spiked again in early 1979. The People's Republic of China launched a short, intense border war, hitting towns, roads, and outposts across northern provinces. Vietnamese units rushed north while repairing damaged rail and bridges under fire. The fighting ended after weeks, but the frontier stayed tense and militarized. Diplomatic ties froze, trade routes shifted, and defense spending crowded out investment in civilian recovery. During the worst years of isolation, inflation reportedly ran in triple digits, and wages dissolved between paydays as markets repriced rice, salt, and kerosene overnight. The 1990s opened with a pivot. Vietnamese leaders rolled out Doi Moi, loosening central controls and allowing private enterprise to operate alongside state firms. Cooperatives gave way to household farming, which boosted rice output and turned the country into a major exporter. Small workshops registered as private companies. Markets replaced ration coupons, and foreign investors returned to survey industrial parks and port upgrades. The banking system began cautious reforms, recognizing non-performing loans and allowing new credit channels. None of this happened overnight. Ministries revised price controls, scrapped some subsidies, and tested pilot zones where taxes and customs rules were simpler. The shift created space for entrepreneurs while keeping core sectors under state direction. Diplomacy followed economics. In 1995, Washington and Hanoi normalized relations, clearing the path for trade agreements, development finance, and educational exchanges. The move stabilized ties in a region adjusting to post-Cold War realities and opened doors for joint work on war legacies. Businesses mapped supply chains from textile mills in the Mekong Delta to electronics assembly near Haiphong. Ports expanded container capacity, and air links multiplied. Tourism began climbing as visas eased and tour operators added routes to former battlefields, highlands, and coastal towns. The two governments continued joint accounting for missing personnel, which built habits of cooperation beyond commerce. The war's residue lingered in fields and bodies. Agent Orange exposure remained a public health crisis, with reports of serious illnesses and disabilities among those who lived or fought in sprayed zones. Rural districts dealt with contaminated soils and waterways, complicating agriculture and fishing. Clinics tracked multi-generational health issues, while aid projects funded care centers and small-scale remediation. Cleanup at former storage sites started to show results when soil treatment and containment facilities went online. The work required long timelines and technical expertise that arrived through new partnerships. Unexploded ordnance posed another daily risk. Provinces along old front lines carried dense clusters of bombs, shells, and mines. Farmers unearthed munitions during planting, and children found small bomblets in scrublands. Clearance teams mapped hotspots, trained local staff, and ran safety classes in schools. Survey data guided excavations, and armored vehicles hauled out rusting casings by the ton. Progress measured in hectares cleared translated into reopened farmland and safer road projects, but the task line stretched far into the future. Abroad, the diaspora built new anchors. Communities in the United States, Australia, France, and Canada grew through churches, mutual aid groups, and Vietnamese language media. Restaurants and markets organized supply chains that linked seafood processors and coffee exporters to suburban storefronts. Cultural festivals funded scholarships and relief drives back home. Political views varied across generations, but connections stayed active through remittances, philanthropy, and business ventures. Students returned to collaborate with universities in Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi, bringing research ties and startup networks. Growth followed reform and connection. Industrial zones attracted footwear, furniture, and electronics producers. Roads and ring highways cut travel times between ports and factory clusters. Ho Chi Minh City rolled out new districts of high-rises and tech parks. Hanoi expanded metro lines and administrative complexes. Smartphones, motorbikes, and e-commerce reshaped daily life. Export earnings lifted household incomes, and rural electrification reached deeper into mountainous provinces. The pace created new challenges: urban congestion, air quality, and the need for skilled labor, but also locked the country into regional supply chains. One reconciliation stands out. Former U.S. Senator John McCain, once a prisoner of war in Hanoi, later helped restore U.S.-Vietnam relations. His role symbolized a bridge from captivity to cooperation, and it set a tone that encouraged practical projects, trade, education, and the shared work of clearing what the war left behind. The story of the Vietnam War has shown how a decades-long struggle reshaped nations, changed millions of lives, and left a legacy that still echoed through the present. Every chapter of this history has revealed the complexity of a conflict that refused to be forgotten. If this journey through the war's past has helped bring clarity or spark curiosity, then subscribing ensures you never miss the next deep dive into history. Thanks for watching.